Welcome to the Right Take Podcast, news, ideas, and conversations at the intersection of politics and culture, a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. I will be your host, Mark Tapson. Welcome back to the Right Take Podcast. I am your host, Mark Tapson. Thank you for joining me here. I know you have innumerable podcast options that could occupy your time, way too many, in fact. I think I was the last adult in America to launch a podcast. I held out as long as I could, but eventually I had to get with the program. And so here I am. And here you are, and I'm honored to have you here. So let's get started. Prior to moving to the Los Angeles area 25 years ago, my God, has it been that long? Believe me, I never intended to still be here after 25 years. Anyway, prior to moving to LA, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for over 20 years, most of that in San Francisco itself. I'm thankful that I got out of there long before it turned into the hellhole of crime, drug addiction, and homelessness that it has infamously become. And I've been shaking my head over the news of the upscale Nordstrom store in San Francisco closing after being in operation for over 35 years. A 312,000 square foot, 5-story department store in the Westfield shopping mall. A spokesman said that, quote, "The dynamics of the downtown San Francisco market have changed dramatically over the past several years, impacting customer foot traffic to our stores and our ability to operate successfully," unquote. Yes, that is certainly a very delicate way to put it. The dynamics have changed dramatically. And by the word dynamics, they're euphemistically referring to the out-of-control lawlessness in Democrat-run San Francisco, the unchecked shoplifting that is plaguing so many stores in the People's Republic of California and in other major urban areas, all run by Democrats. Walmart, Macy's, Walgreens, Best Buy, Bed Bath & Beyond, Target, all these major chains and independent stores that have been shuttering across the country in Democrat-led areas because crime has become such an overwhelming problem. I keep emphasizing that these areas are Democrat-run because it is Democrat policies that have directly led to this deterioration into barbarism of our inner cities. These are policies that could legitimately be called pro-crime. Not soft on crime, not lenient, not criminal reform, but pro-crime policies that have not simply enabled, but encouraged rampant mob lawlessness. This is the party, remember, that calls for defunding the police, that institutes pro-crime attorneys general, that abolishes cash bail, that wants to free felons from prison, that demonizes law enforcement, that tells officers to stand down while Black Lives Matter riots and Antifa assaults citizens in broad daylight, and on and on. Pro-crime. This devolution of law and order is intentional on the part of Democrats who, as part of the tearing down of this country, have sought to drive a stake straight through the heart of the middle class, not only by instituting economically devastating policies, called Bidenomics, but by creating an environment of uncontrolled chaos in our cities. The result is a hemorrhaging of people and businesses from blue cities and blue states as those people and business owners realize that normal life under Democrat leadership has become untenable. And I use the word untenable intentionally, and I'll explain why in just a moment. It's a new kind of flight from the cities that is reminiscent of the white flight of the 1960s and 70s, a sociological phenomenon that the left likes to dismiss as white racism. But what is the truth about white flight? Prominent figures on the left, like Michelle Obama, have commented upon it recently in ways that perpetuate this simplistic narrative because it bolsters their insistence that America is systemically racist and that white people are inherently racist. Wikipedia, which is run and moderated by left-wing political activists, describes white flight very misleadingly as, quote, "the sudden or gradual large-scale migration of white people from areas becoming more racially or ethno-culturally diverse," unquote. The suggestion here is that white people would rather pack up and flee the homes and states they lived in than live next door to a black person. You know that old line, "Well, there goes the neighborhood," when a non-white family moved in. That's how the left wants you to think about white flight, that white racism is the problem and the explanation. But what is the truth? Yes, the narrative that has been pushed for decades by the left-leaning media and race-hustling activists and politicians is that white flight occurred quite simply because whites are racist. Funny how you never hear the side of the story from the white people who participated in that flight. Left-leaning historians and political pundits don't ever bother to actually interview those people about it because that would complicate the narrative. That might put to the lie the narrative that America is systemically racist and that white people are inherently racist. Well, today, at the Right Take podcast, I'm going to speak with a journalist who did the work that those propagandists fail to do. In his brand new book called Untenable, which is why I pointedly used that word a moment ago, he tells the truth about white flight from the perspective no one wants to hear. That book is based upon his own personal experience growing up in Newark, New Jersey, and on many dozens of interviews of people, both white and black, who spoke about white flight from the perspective of their own lived experience. So please stay with us because you do not want to miss this discussion. I think you'll find it fascinating because it's not a perspective you're likely to hear anywhere else. So stay tuned. And don't forget to subscribe to The Right Take so that you don't miss any of the conversations we're having here. Remember, if you like what you hear, please leave a review. It really helps. We'll be right back with my guest after this awesome musical interlude. Don't touch that dial. My guest today at the intersection of politics and culture is Jack Cashill, a journalist and author of at least 15 nonfiction books, including, I think, 3 about Barack Obama. He's written for Fortune, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Weekly Standard, a lot of other places. He's taught media and literature at Purdue and other universities. I think a lot of people may not know that he's also a documentary filmmaker, but most recently he's the author of a brand new book called Untenable, the true story of white ethnic flight from America's cities. And we are going to talk about that and some other things today. Jack Cashill, welcome to the Right Take podcast.
Hey, Mark, thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jack, before we get into the meat and the substance of your new book, Untenable, let's talk about the reaction it's getting and a controversy that may be developing around it. As I understand it, you were scheduled to speak recently at a New York State library about the book, but you were then, quote unquote, uninvited by the state library board because they claimed that they were, quote, unprepared to handle violent situations, unquote. Can you give us the backstory on that and a little more detail as to why they supposedly feared that your presence and a discussion of the book would spark some violence?
Well, yeah, this is pure trickle-down cancel culture, Mark. The irony is the town in question has a Republican mayor in a county that gave Trump a 20-point margin of victory. And yet the library board felt free to, their phrase was to, quote, disinvite me, having invited me to speak on my book, Untenable. And Untenable is in large part a memoir. And it's not overly controversial, other than the fact that it has the word white on the cover and it also says true, which suggests that the story I'm telling in Untenable may reveal that the story that these people have been telling each other is untrue. But this being a small town, and I've been spending my summers here for the last 35 years, my wife is a donor to the library. I got all the documentation on it. And it's just, what it shows is just how banal woke culture can be, I mean, I know it's Hannah Arendt said the banality of evil in reference, I think, to Adolf Eichmann. It's not that level of evil, obviously, but it is that level of banality.
I know you've written elsewhere that libraries are kind of notoriously hostile to unorthodox or unpopular ideas, at least when those ideas come from the right, which is absolutely correct. I mean, it's unthinkable that the New York Public Library system would disinvite, for example, Ibram X. Kendi or Robin DiAngelo, the anti-racism authors. But you and your book somehow represent a threat. I understand that one board member said, "We haven't silenced him, we have uninvited him." And they suggested kind of insultingly that I think you use the gazebo in the park next door. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And, my wife went to the library board. I was out of town, but she went to the library board meeting and recorded it. And it's it's a wonderland of Orwellian doublethink and excuse making. When you the way the left cancels the right typically is simply not to invite you someplace, and no one notices that you're not invited. But when they invite you, announce that you're coming, right, and then they disinvite you, it's total egg on their face. So you listen to the school board, the library board, trying to explain it away, and it's a hoot. I mean, one example they raised as a reason why it was necessary to disinvite me, because a year ago this August, Salman Rushdie was attacked at the Chautauqua Institute. And we're in Chautauqua County. We're about 20 miles away. And they feared that in their explanation, that an incident like this would take place if I were to speak. Even though they admitted in a memo to my wife that all the protesters were females, right? Oddly, the guy says, oddly, all the complainants were females. Oddly, no. Inevitably, they're called Karens for a reason, right? And these aren't Antifa females. These are, middle-aged biddies with too much time on their hands.
Okay, about the book itself, this is obviously a very personal book for you. It's a memoir, as you put it. It stems from your own upbringing as a lower middle-class white boy growing up around blacks in Newark, New Jersey. By the way, did I say that correctly? Newark? I know it's supposed to be just one syllable, right?
One syllable. It's say it as you would cork or pork and just put an N in front of it, Newark, right? No one pronounces it. The only people who pronounce it right are the people who are from Newark. So it's,
I'll have to practice that. You dedicated this book to your late father, who was a police officer. And you write at the beginning of it that, quote, "It is for his sake and the sake of all the dispossessed that I share this saga of our unwelcome diaspora," unquote. I don't think most people think of white flight as an unwelcome diaspora. Why did you write this book about the white flight from America's cities? Let's start with that.
Well, first of all, Mark, I've been watching this over the years. It bothered me from the time I was an adolescent. The way the media covered our situation turned me from a young preteen for Kennedy into basically something other than a Democrat, something other than a liberal. I saw the way the media were treating people in our circumstance. So on TV, for instance, they gave us Archie Bunker, right? Which, if you're Norman Lear sitting in Brentwood, probably makes sense to you. But if you're Archie Bunker living in a city in which the violent crime rate has increased 400% in the last 20 years, it doesn't make any sense at all. And I lived in 1960, the year Kennedy ran, the year my whole neighborhood voted Democratic. And it was a totally Catholic neighborhood, mostly Irish and Italian. It was an idyllic neighborhood. I was the word that so many of the people I spoke to used to describe it, idyllic. It was a working class neighborhood. It was virtually all my friends were renters. Most of the people were in our neighborhood. My father bought a 1880 fixer-upper on the GI Bill, and we were the only homeowners that I knew. So the notion of blockbusting made no sense to describe what happened in our neighborhood. Nor did the schools make any sense, because virtually all of us went to Catholic schools. They were great. We loved them. We had 2 movie theaters within 2 blocks. We had every kind of ethnic food within 2 blocks. We had every kind of service within 2 blocks. Mom and pop, this and that. A diner, a candy store, a soda fountain. I mean, everything that a little kid or any adult would want. I didn't learn to ride a bicycle till I was 30, because I never had the need. And it was very, collegial, harmonious neighborhood where, in the absence of backyards, everyone's set out front on their stoops to their porches. And so it was very communal. And by 1970, that was all gone.
And what happened in that period? What happened in the 60s in Newark and similar communities around the country? And I'm talking about prior to the 1967 riots that you addressed near the end of the book, which I'll ask you about in a moment. But what happened to change things?
Mark, it had been brewing for some time. The problem started, it's easy to pin this all on LBJ, although he institutionalized much of the problems. I trace it back probably to even post-war 50s, where the zeitgeist changed from the understanding among the people who administered justice, who administered social work, etc., from the notion that the individual was responsible for his own destiny to the notion that the system is responsible. So if you don't succeed, it's not your fault. The song Officer Krupke in West Side Story really parodies that nicely. And that came out in 1957. I'm sociologically disturbed. Right. It's not your fault anymore. Someone's there waiting and willing to excuse you. It's kind of an involved story, but when they cut off immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in 1924, they did not cut off immigration from the South, from the Black South. And so, and what had once been multiple streams of immigrants coming into the city, migrants, Black, German, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and now is simply Black. And so the poorer areas of the city and the lower rungs on the ladder were now being filled by Black migrants. And there became a sense of, a growing gap between working class whites and Blacks. It wasn't a gap until the Black population was seduced by, post-war welfare social programs that culminated with the Great Society, in which if you did not have a father in the home, a married father, you were eligible for Medicaid, you were eligible for food stamps, you were reduced rate on your rent, you were eligible for just a host of benefits, including welfare itself. And it had its impact especially on the Black culture immediately. And by the mid-'60s, that was becoming painfully evident.
You anticipated a question I was going to ask a little bit later, but I think I'll bring it up now. Can you talk about the role that the breakdown of the family and this scourge of fatherlessness has played in this whole story of white flight, and why this huge factor has been and continues to be ignored by the media and by politicians?
Mark, that's an excellent question. The U.S. Census releases its data 72 years after the fact. It was like it was JFK's brain or something. I don't know why, but that's what they do. So fortunately for me, the 1950 census became available in 2022 when I was doing my research. So I was able to see what my block looked like in 1950, just before we moved there, a few years before. At that time, there were 85 families on the block. 83 of them had married male heads of households. There were 2 widows. Of the 83, 2 were retired, 2 were unemployed, 79 had jobs. I list many of them in the book. Every working class, every blue-collar occupation under the sun, short of like lumberjack, is located there. Casket maker, rubber molder, vegetable huckster. I mean, it was just a wonderland of real blue-collar work. I mean, and there wasn't a college graduate on the block as far as I could tell. When we moved to the block in 1953, we moved to a triplex at the top of the block. The triplex next to us was occupied by 3 Black families. So the block, and my history was always integrated. There were immigrants on my block. I'm talking now one street, 2 sides of the street. It was a 1 block long street called Myrtle Avenue. There were immigrants from 14 countries on the block, different countries. So it was a heterodox, multi-ethnic neighborhood. And it stayed stable for 10 years. No one cut and ran when the first Black families moved in because they loved their neighborhood, right? It was such a nicely harmonious, functional neighborhood. It wasn't until the welfare-type families began moving in the early to mid-'60s that the problem the block began to deteriorate. And then on my block in particular, it took a real hit when the state highway department decided to put what would prove to be an interstate right through the middle of our block, which took my house. And that totally accelerated the decline of the neighborhood, as you can imagine. And it was never the same after that. And you're right, there were thousands of neighborhoods like it all across America. The ethnic composition would be different, but I talk about neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, all the way to Los Angeles even, that experienced the same phenomenon, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, but inevitably.
You just anticipated another question of mine that I think I'll just go ahead and insert here. When you mentioned the highway, what about this notion that's taken pretty much as gospel among the anti-racist crowd that urban planners across America consciously used highways to divide white and black neighborhoods? I think, even Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary diversity hire, he said something along those lines back in November of 2021, namely that America built its highways on, as you put it, a bedrock of hate. Is there any truth to that?
No, I mean, there are half truths that I dispel in the course of this book, but this is a 100% non truth. Highway planners just built their highways wherever they felt like building them. In Newark, they put two interstates through Newark. One went through the heart of our Irish Italian neighborhood, and the other went through the heart of the Jewish neighborhood. In neither case, and at that time, Newark was 35% black. If they wanted to do some dividing, they weren't very good shots. I mean, they missed, their aim was off. Then I looked around the country to see if I could find any place where there was a highway that was consciously planned to divide white from black. I could not. And it's hard to find one where even unconsciously it ended up doing that. So the first highway under Buttigieg's plan to racify the highways was a highway that was built right through the heart of a black Detroit neighborhood. It wasn't done to divide. It was just done because that's where they wanted to put it. Our neighborhood went because, we were working class people. We didn't have much voice to protest. It wouldn't have cost that much. It's cheaper. Our house was sold they paid us $7,000 for our house. It's a lot. Stayed a lot of money by taking down $7,000 houses instead of $20,000 houses or whatever. So they were just relentless. But not just with the highway people, but in the 50s and 60s, the urban developers were just reckless and indifferent to the lives they were uprooting and the neighborhoods they were displacing.
And about the deterioration of those neighborhoods, you write near the beginning of the book that you asked a lifelong friend who happened to be a loyal Democrat, as you note, why in the early 70s he and his widowed mother left the street that you both grew up on 20 years after the first black families moved in. You write that he searched for a little bit for the right words and then said simply, well, it became untenable. What exactly did he mean by that, and why did you latch onto that word as the title of your book?
Well, my original title was to be Dispossessed. And then the subtitle was The Untold Stories of America's Great Ethnic Diaspora. My real goal was to talk about the people who were dispossessed, who had to leave these neighborhoods under duress. But when I walked that title by people, they were like, huh? What are you talking about, dispossessed? I had too much explaining. So I was looking for a new title. And I'm talking to my friend Artie. And you're right, he's among my friends who left that neighborhood, he's the only one that I know remained a Democrat, because the process alerted us to the ravages that the Democratic Party was wrecking on blue-collar America and the indifference they felt towards doing it. But he's remained a Democrat, partly for union reasons. His wife is pretty woke. She was kind of hovering in the background. He was trying to be, appropriate. And he said, it became untenable. And I said, Artie, what do you mean by untenable? And he said, well, Jack, when your mother gets mugged for the second time, that's untenable. When your home gets invaded for the second time, that's untenable. And as soon as I heard that word, I said, bingo. Because Artie's story, by a million, is the story of white ethnic flight from America's cities.
And what about, in terms of being mugged, what about the first time you were officially mugged? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I have an advantage over other people in that my first mugging, official mugging, made the Newark Evening News. And it's a classic story of just the way our neighborhood was starting to turn. I was 9 years old at the time, and my mother sent me to the local grocer to buy something. She gave me a $5 bill, which is like, in our world, it was like giving me the keys to Fort Knox, And I remember it very distinctly. I had $3 in change. I stuck it in my back pocket. I didn't have a wallet. I didn't have keys. I didn't have keys till I started college. I didn't have a wallet till I started college. And so I'm walking home, and then I feel a pair of hands come over my eyes. And I could sense that it was a black person. And I said, "Hey, Earl." I have my black friend in our little group on the block. And then when I felt the hands rifling through my pockets, I knew it wasn't Earl. And before I could even figure out what was going on, the money was gone. I turn around and I see these three black kids running away. They're a few years older than I was. I could tell I wasn't going to go chase them. So I'm half a block from my home. I walk home, and I'm more anxious about telling my mother about losing $3 than I was about the robbery. But I tell her, and she immediately calls my father, who's a youth aid detective working in a precinct a couple blocks away. So he comes. Now, the scene of the crime is about 50 yards from a public school on my block. It's about half black at that time. So we go over to the school, which seems like a likely place to find the suspect. And we talk to the school principal. And she said, "Oh, none of our boys would ever do this. Oh, that's not, our boys wouldn't do this." So she suggested we go to South 8th Street School. It was about a mile away when it's like 90% black. Well, no, my father said, "Ma'am, we're, stone's throw from the crime scene. This is probably the place." So I only saw these guys from the back, which made it difficult. And my father's a little skeptical, and my mother was, about whether I'd actually been robbed. So we go class to class. And then finally in the last classroom, usually embarrassing, this kid pulls a book up in front of his face. And I've watched enough Dragnet to see the signs. I said, "Dad, that must be one of the guys." And he jumps up and he says, "I didn't take that boy's $3." My father said, "Son, we got some talking to do in that office." He rats out his two buddies, and justice is served. But as we're walking away from I remember this distinctly because my father never was not a kind of person to make ethnic comments, especially about Jews. And first of all, since there were very few Jews in our neighborhood, everyone got along pretty well. And he said, "The trouble with Jews is they think blacks can do no wrong." Oh, he said coloreds. He said coloreds could do no wrong. Well, I didn't know the principal was Jewish. I wasn't savvy to that. And that's partly why I use the word ethnic in the title, because every group in Newark or throughout the country, ethnic group, responded differently to black in-migration into the cities. The ethnic group that was most welcoming were Jews. And, they're most liberal and most accepting. And yet, ironically, they were the first and quickest to leave but for one good reason, and that is they, unlike Irish and Italians, Croats, Poles, they depended on public schools. And they had high expectations for those schools. And once those expectations could not be met, they felt like they had no choice but to leave. And they did. So the Italians, on the other hand, you get called a racist if you leave. You get called a racist if you stay. The Italians were the most coherent and the toughest of all the white ethnics. And they weren't going to leave. You're going to have to drag them out of the neighborhood. They fought back. And for that, they, of course, were called racist. So it didn't really matter how you responded. You were a racist in the end anyhow.
When you hear the term white privilege, what does that mean to you and to other whites who grew up when and where you did and in similar communities?
It's sort of like I hear the word white privilege like a punchline to a joke. I mean, I was involved in a debate on reparations earlier this summer, in which the people on the other side of the debate were ludicrous. I mean, just flat out. They had no idea what it was like growing up white. And that's part of the reason I tell the story of my neighborhood. Before we came of age, most of our, as I said, every one of my childhood friends had a living relative who was born in a foreign country. And so we all heard ancestral stories. My family is Irish by and large. There was a lot of mixing by this time. I was 1/4 German. My one grandmother was German. She grew up a couple blocks from a woman named Catherine Schaub. Catherine Schaub, in 19, I believe the year was 1917, as a 15-year-old, immigrant kids didn't go to high school. They just went to eighth grade and then they went to the workforce. That's what privilege was like as late as 1920 or so. My grandmother married young, William Cashill, my grandfather. But Catherine Schaub got a great job at the local radium lithograph, I think it's a radium factory. And she invited her cousin and some friends, and they all went to work there. All they had to do was paint brushes with radium and put them on dial handles. Well, within a few years, virtually all of them were dead. That was not what white privilege, that was what white privilege was really like circa 1920. And there was an excellent book written about these girls called The Radium Girls. And it took place right in my neighborhood. The factory was, a couple blocks from my house. And it just added a poignancy to their story. But they all, neither my mother or her brother went to high school, My father went to a Votech high school. And that was, they had no accumulated wealth. They were all renters. They didn't have any kind of backlog of, residual, bond payments coming in, or no one in my world saved for college. The guys I talked to in my generation, out of my grade school, I should say, only two of us went right from high school to college. Me and a black friend of mine. Everyone else went, and I talked to at least 20 guys who fit this description: high school, Army. A lot of them went to Vietnam. Some of them didn't come back. Job, college patched around a job. And then now they can't live in Newark anymore, so they're forced to live in the nearest suburbs they can afford. Many of them moved to Ocean County, New Jersey, which sounds nicer than it is, but these are, like ramshackle suburbs being carved out of the pine barrens, just slapdash thrown together. And they're 50 or 60 miles from Newark. People making these heroic commutes. And as a result of this, by the way, I should say, in a blue state like Ocean County, like New Jersey, Ocean County votes 2-1 Trump. And it's for that reason. So many of these people turn party allegiances. Their families were all Democrats. They all end up Republicans. And the political scientists don't talk about this phenomenon because they don't want to talk about what really happened to the cities.
I think your book has to be the only one that I'm aware of that addresses the whole issue of white flight from the perspective of the whites who lived through it themselves. I think the general attitude is the one reflected in something that Michelle Obama said a couple of years ago, and you even quoted in the book when she was making a speech of some sort, and she blamed it on white racism. Can you talk a little bit about that quote? And how that reflects the general attitude about white flight?
The quote is, it was insulting. And this quote, Michelle's quote, was insulting for several reasons. One is that she says, you left because of the color of our skin and the texture of our hair. Nice, respectable families like ours, first time you see them, you run. And then she turns to her audience, which is largely white and liberal female, and says, and you all still run it, right? Well, here's where the irony comes in, Mark, is that Michelle has had very good parents, Marion and Fraser Robinson. Fraser was a precinct captain in the Daily Machine, and he had a front job as some sort of water, engineer or something. But they moved into, in 1950, a brand new co-op. There was, I think, not exclusively black, but it might as well have been de facto all black. And it was such a marvel of modern technology that both the U.S. senators from Illinois attended the opening. By 1970, Parkway Gardens was untenable because they had built public housing projects around it. And so when Michelle's brother Craig started school, brand new school, block away, after his first 2 years there, Michelle's mother, Marion, said, So what she did is she took young Michelle, who's about ready to start school, and Craig, and drove them 15 minutes each way to a transitional Jewish black neighborhood. which was a Class C misdemeanor, and they would have had to repay the school district if they had been caught. So once there, they go to the local public school, which is by the time they start, and they move to the neighborhood a couple of years later, it's almost entirely black again. The Jews have left, but the school still has a reputation for excellence, which is no longer deserved. But so when it comes time for high school, rather than send Michelle and Craig to the public high school a block or two away, all black or close to all black, they send Craig to a Catholic high school that's virtually all white, even though the Robinsons aren't Catholic, and Marion has to take a job to pay for that. And then they send Michelle to a magnet school, which is mostly non-black downtown, and it's more than an hour away. So she's been running from blacks her whole life. I mean, Martha's Vineyard doesn't get much further, much farther from a black neighborhood than that. I don't know. I know. I take it back. They do have some illegal immigrants living there now, so it's much cozier. But no, it's insulting, totally insulting. And in the book, I cite several black families that did exactly the same thing. I use celebrity stories because they write their memoirs. The one closest to home is that of Whitney Houston's mother, Sissy. And Whitney Houston and I were born in the same hospital. And when I talk about institutional racism, I mentioned that by 1900, Presbyterian Hospital, where we were both born, was being praised because it had an open door policy, people of all races, which wasn't true in lots of parts of America, like the South, et cetera. So Sissy and her husband, John Houston, are living in closer to the Jewish neighborhoods on the other side of town. But she said in a cozy village, mixed race village in the 1960s. And then she said, but the crime and the violence started getting worse and worse. And then she said when the 67 riots hit the city, she said they didn't hit our neighborhood, but they got too close. And I said to John, we're out of here. So 3 years later, they moved to the suburbs. Kanye West's mother, who grew up in Michelle's neighborhood, South Shore of Chicago. He gets mugged. He gets his bicycle stolen. His mother says, call it black flight, call it whatever. We're out of here. They moved to the suburbs. Any responsible parent under those same circumstances would have done the same thing. But only whites were singled out for blame. And that's part of what drove me to write this book.
Well, that also ties in with the whole progressive narrative that whites must be the oppressor, that, they run with this whole victimhood narrative from as early as the 1960s on, in which whites are cast as the oppressor. And I think Michelle Obama's quote reflects that narrative that she's trying to push, that they're trying to push. And also the black author Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a very highly awarded author. As you point out in the book, he wrote, quote, that white flight was not an accident. It was a triumph of racist social engineering, unquote. How radically wrong is that statement?
It's not sociology. It's pure conspiracy theory. When you look at the motives of the people involved, speaking of banality, most of the people who were doing this thought they were doing good. In a city like Newark, though, public-private partnerships quickly devolved. And we had, because you have the dreamers who believe that highways and new public housing projects would be a good idea, high rises. And then you have the schemers like the Boiardo family, who were the models for the Sopranos, who come from Newark, and at least the fictional Sopranos do. And for them, the idea of public-private partnership was, you dream of building this clearing. They cleared Little Italy in Newark. I mean, this is how indifferent they were to the racial niceties. They cleared thousands of residents of this thriving Little Italy neighborhood in Newark, one of the most vibrant Italian neighborhoods in America. This is in 1950-53, to build a housing project. They did it to white people too. And what would happen, though, what was accelerating that is that crime families like the Boiardos in a city like Newark, seeing all this federal money coming into the city, these are 90% federal dollars coming in. They literally started demolition companies, right? And then they elect a mayor who's in bed with them, Agnasio, in this case, who would end up going to prison for a long time, who gave him my Eagle Scout Award, though, who was taking a slice of the action. So you had a collaboration in these cities between the schemers and the dreamers that so defies the Ta-Nehisi Coates, paradigm that it makes him. If you know the real story, I read his stuff and I have to laugh. It's just ridiculous.
What? Let's get to the 1967 Newark riots. Can you talk about the impact that had on the country? In fact, because I think a lot of people today may not remember that or know much about it. Can you describe a little bit about the riots and the impact that it had, and also maybe the role that professional agitators like Tom Hayden and Saul Alinsky and Amiri Baraka, people like that, the role that they may have played in those riots?
No, Mark. Yeah, there were the Newark riots in 1967, in which about 25 people died, was the first big conflagration in the north central United States. It was followed a few weeks later by the riot in Detroit, which was of comparable magnitude. And they said they reverberated across the nation, even not just in Newark and Detroit, but they had put white people on edge across the nation, and black people as well, like Whitney Houston's mom, who said, "No, I'm out of here." And peeling away this story, I did not know this before. When I heard the phrase rebellion in Newark, I said, yeah, just they're dressing up the word riot. But then when you look behind the scenes, and Newark was like the Casablanca for misbegotten revolutionaries, all sort of coming together. Tom Hayden, who would go on to marry Jane Fonda, he was the drafter of the Port Huron Statement at the Students for Democratic Society. He's white. He brought his whole crew to Newark. There was at least a dozen people. Also in the mix were Amiri Baraka, who's a homegrown radical, Leroy Jones, who is also, Leroy Jones' real name. He went by Amiri Baraka as Leroy Jones. It was a well-known playwright whose movie The Dutchman was whose play The Dutchman was made into a movie. But you also had guys like Ron Karenga, who's the guy who gave us Kwanzaa, right? The inventor of Kwanzaa. He was in Newark. And he would go on, a few years later, he would be sent to prison for kidnapping and torturing a few black women. So there's the father of Kwanzaa for you. Not exactly Saint Nick. And then there was, then there'd be people passing through like Stokely Carmichael, the guy who gave us Black Power. And then there was even stranger guys who, I can't even remember their name I talk about. But also there was the deadliest mosque, Nation of Islam mosque in the country, the Newark Mosque, who's under the guidance of the orchestration of Farrakhan. It was the guys from Newark Mosque who assassinated in 1965 Malcolm X in full view of his family. So there was a stew of people who were consciously trying to stir up stuff, and they had as fodder for their explosions a growing number of fatherless young men in a city like Newark. By the time of the riots in '67, a full 25% of those involved were living in fatherless homes. And my neighborhood, which was, on the fringe of those riots, the fatherless percentage was about 1 or 2%. It was so small that we knew people we had one guy we called Broken Home Bobby because he was living with his uncle, and his aunt, and his mother. That was the extent of broken homeness. And we didn't know that phenomenon because the Irish, Italians, and Jews were all very strong on family formation. And so you have this increasingly estranged, alienated, disaffected group of young black men who are listening to the likes of Baraka and Karenga and Farrakhan, and they're beginning to turn their anger, which is probably against their father or their mother, against being there, but you're channeling that anger, consciously channeling that anger of the broke child from a broken home away from the parents or away from, their family structure towards white people. And in the conflagration in '67 was, there was an incident that set it off, but anything could have set it off. Same thing like with George Floyd in 2020. George Floyd could have been 100 other incidents.
Let's fast forward to today a little bit. What about the flight that we are seeing today of people and companies from blue cities and blue states to red cities and red states? These Democrat-run cities are just becoming hellholes of crime and drug addiction and homelessness with no indication that their leaders intend to do anything about it. What kind of a flight is this? Is this a new kind of white flight or an extension of the old, or is it even a white flight at all? Is it just a middle class flight of people of all colors? How does this fleeing of blue cities and blue states relate to the white flight we've been talking about?
I call it white flight 2.0. The difference, and you are absolutely right, it's the woke cities specifically that are hemorrhaging people. I mean, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, Chicago, San Francisco. And, the media will write about this, but they won't say, it's the woke cities. But you don't see Nashville on that list. You don't see Tampa on that list. You don't see Austin on that list or Dallas. And here's the difference, is that when blue-collar people were forced to flee, we never got to tell our stories. Today, the people who are fleeing are the skinny jeans laptop class. They're the ones who are writing the headlines and writing the stories. And so it's not white flight. There's no hint of racist motivation, even though the great majority of people leaving are white. So I've read a bunch of articles on this. They're semi-comical because they just go out of their way to almost absolve themselves of any hint of racism in this departure. But what we're seeing is something like we saw in the 60s, which was a loosening of all social restraints. But now we're loosening on top of the loosening, right? So, the kind of bad behavior we're seeing today, you would have gotten shot for in the 60s. If you had, a huge smash and grab, there'd be dead police, like people laying outside the street, and the cops would be there with their guns smoking and their cigarettes smoking too. In Newark, they shot at looters, right? So you really it was a different ball game. It is like first time was tragedy, second time it's farce. It's repeating itself, and God, I love San Francisco. I went to high school in New York, love New York, and I can't go to those places anymore. But I don't live there, thank God. And so and then the rest of the world, for instance, I'm right now talking to you I have a place right on Lake Erie. I can't show it to you because people aren't going to see this anyhow. But I look out the window, all I see is water. This is Trump County I mentioned earlier. Race isn't even an issue here. Crime isn't an issue. Crime is like pink flamingos being stolen off someone's lawn. So the people in these removes, like most Republicans living in small towns and suburbs, aren't engaged in this. But they really should be, because if the cities fall, the country falls.
Let me shift gears a little bit and ask you about the process of writing the book itself. It seems that you interviewed, I don't know how many people about this, but you seemed obviously eager to tell the stories of whites themselves involved in the white flight because no one else was writing their stories. How did you go about gathering all this information and collecting all these stories from must have been dozens of people that you interviewed?
Yeah, the mechanics of it are interesting. I was very fortunate in some ways. First of all, I'm on Facebook, which was enormously helpful because my grade school has an alumni association, very active on Facebook, right? And my neighborhood has a neighborhood association, and which people are. And so I reached out through that, looking for volunteers, and and a lot of people are reluctant because they're shy. Like they understand that there could be some blowback to a story about white flight, and but most people were very forthcoming. Then I had a few friends who intervened with their friends, and so more and more people were willing to step up. So I interviewed through one means or another at least 50 people. Then I had my own family, which was not just my immediate family. I have two brothers and a sister, but my cousins and other people who were involved as well. Um, and that was the start. And then I got lucky. I'm going to say this because, I live my neighborhood is a unassuming part of Newark. It's not famous. It's not like Week Wake, which Philip Roth made famous, uh, or the North, the Little Italy North Ward, First Ward, which is, famous for having spawned about half the rock and rollers you've ever heard of, like Joey D and the Starlighters and Frankie Valli and whatnot. Uh, Ours is just unassuming mixed ethnic neighborhood. It just so happened, though, that the Radium Girls were there, right? It just so happened that Mo Berg lived there. And Mo Berg is, I find this story fascinating. He was, you probably know it, Mark. I mean, he was a Major League Baseball player. There weren't that many Jews in our neighborhood, but his was one of them. Family was one of them. Goes to Princeton University, then Columbia University Law School. Brilliant guy, smartest guy in Major League Baseball. Sticks around for 18 years, largely because everyone liked him as a teammate. Not because he never started. He was backup most of his career. But he was a smart guy, spoke a half dozen languages. He goes into the OSS during World War II, which was the predecessor to CIA. And his job is to lure physicists out of Europe and bring them back to the United States. And top on his list was, what's his name? Heisenberg, who was the Breaking Bad's alias, and the Walter White's alias was for those people who watch Breaking Bad. And then he comes back to our neighbor, Newark, and he's living a couple blocks from my house. He's walking around the neighborhood all the time, hanging out at places we hung out at. And I just didn't know who he was. I'm sure I passed him 100 times. And he has kind of a breakdown, like many returning veterans, and ends up getting mugged just like everyone else and living this sad, dispirited life. His brother, who he lived with, Sam, was like a doctor. He lived, his office was a couple blocks from the house. And fortunately, he took 2,700 photos of the neighborhood, and they're available at the Newark Library. So I just found myself with one resource after another that I didn't expect. And then the 1950 census comes out, and then I start finding these unpublished, I should say self-published books that aren't in wide circulation. Like this one black fellow who wrote a book on growing up in Columbus homes, which was priceless, more honest and forthright than just about any sociology book I ever read. Books by firemen, cops, that were self-published and, maybe 100 people read in their lifetime. But they were a gold mine of information. So you put this all together and, I have my own memories and those of my family. And, I will say this, my brother, my Irish twin, who professes to be a liberal, loved the book. He said, no, you're absolutely right. He had nothing to complain about. And nor did he fact check me. He said, no, he said, no, you didn't make anything up. Now, unlike Barack Obama, there are no composites in my book. I change names occasionally to protect people, but these are real people who've lived real lives.
Well, it makes for compelling storytelling and compelling reading for a nonfiction book. Are you working on anything new now? What are you working on, or are you just still in the process of recovering from finishing this one?
Right now I'm in sort of the marketing phase on this one, and I do a lot of what's the word? Someplace between editing and ghostwriting, right? Mark, I've done about 30 books for other people, most of whom you've heard of, and I prefer to call it editing because it's ghostwriting. I never put my name on a book, even in the acknowledgement section. And it's like a lot of book doctoring. But I just think about this today. The next project I'd like to do is, and I know Julie Kelly owns this world, but I'd really like to get into January 6th, on the individual storytelling level. I just wrote an article, for instance, about a kid I live in Kansas City now, who's a college kid in Kansas City and goes to the events on January 6th. His name's Angelo Pacheco. He's a Hispanic kid. He's like jockey size. He can't be more than 5'2", 110 pounds, whatever. And I read the FBI report. It's pathetic. It sounded like it was written by a female agent. I don't know why I sensed that, and they spent 2.5 years running this kid down. And here's what he did. Pacheco walked into the foyer of the Capitol, looked around. 6 seconds later, he left. 4 counts, right? 4 charges against him, including rioting, parading, it's just pathetic. I multiply that by 1,000. This is the greatest injustice we've seen in our lifetime domestically. And it goes, it's well beyond that. And but there's a lot of stories there. And I like to tell stories about people rather than, I use statistics and facts to back things up. But so in my previous book, Unmasking Obama, I had a commission to write a book on Obama. I'm tired about Obama. I wrote about the people who broke the stories about Obama, who broke all those scandals open. And they were almost inevitably, citizen journalists, a lot of them working without pay, while the mainstream did not break a single major story about Obama in 8 years. They all came from the bottom up. So I like heroes. I like to have stories about people who do good things. And so I'm always, looking for even stories when I write stories about, troubling events like TWA Flight 800 or the death of Ron Brown. I try to find someone who's on the inside fighting to get the truth out and write the story about them. So, for instance, my summer home, I have a summer home here in Lake Erie. The woman who lives here during the winter is the woman who found the hole in the top of Ron Brown's head. I collect people like this, in my life. He was a forensic pathologist for U.S. Navy, for the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. And what people don't know is that revelation cost her and 3 pathologists their careers for going public with that information. So it's a strange world we live in, but,
Jack, where's the best place for people to go to keep up with what you are doing and what you're writing? Would it be Facebook or your website?
No, I mean, they can go to Facebook. Yeah, that's fine. Or Cashill. I have a website. It's Cashill, CASHILL.com. But I'd recommend Facebook is good because it's, I post all my articles on Facebook. What I have to do on Facebook, though, I don't know about you, Mark, but I have to post my links in the comments section because if I link, I get shadow banned. And that wasn't true 2 years ago, but now it's all the time. Even a benign link gets shadow banned. So, and I'm on Twitter also, just Jack Cashill every place. But now, it's, what's really refreshing is to talk to someone an interviewer who's read the book and knows the book. Makes her a much more, much richer experience.
For what it's worth, that's been my experience with Facebook too, is the shadow banning where I have to post links in the comments section. Otherwise, almost no one sees it.
That's right. I'm waiting for them to figure that out.
Yeah. People, I urge you to get a copy of Untenable, The True Story of White Ethnic Flight from America's Cities by Jack Cashill. It's drawn favorable comparisons with J.D. Vance's best-selling book from a few years ago, Hillbilly Elegy, if you read that, in the way that it looks at an important national issue through a really personal lens. It's a story that you will not find anywhere else on an important topic that too many people have a vested interest in not wanting to talk about. Jack, thanks so much for coming on today at the Right Take Podcast.
Hey, Mark, excellent interview. I really enjoyed it. Keep up the good work, okay?
Thank you. Listeners, thanks for joining us. Just another reminder to subscribe to The Right Take so that you don't miss any of the great conversations we're having here. And if you like what you hear, please leave a review. It helps a lot, and you will have my eternal gratitude. Thanks, and see you next time. The Right Take with Mark Tapson is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.